So how often do you actually stop and, think about race and ethnicity, not just as these big abstract ideas you hear about, but as these like quiet forces
Yeah.
really shaping your everyday life?
Yeah.
I mean, from filling out a job application to assumptions people might make when you just walk into a room or even school policies.
It's true. It's woven into the fabric of things, often in ways we don't consciously notice. They're not just classroom topics.
Right. They influence opportunities, perceptions, daily experiences.
Absolutely.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today, well, it's to unpack some really key sources on race and ethnicity. We want to pull out the most vital insights for you.
And this isn't just about definitions. It's about understanding the forces that shape your world, the one you navigate every single day.
We'll be looking at insights from Eduardo Bonilla-Silva on colorblind racism, Beverly Daniel Tatum's work defining racism, Can We Talk? And also Jennifer Lee and Min Zhu's research on the success frame and Asian American achievement.
Mm-hmm. Foundational stuff. Our goal is really to understand these ideas, see how they play out in real life, and use sociological perspectives to kind of shed light on these complex dynamics.
Okay, so let's lay some groundwork. Race and ethnicity. People use them interchangeably all the time, but sociologically there's a difference, right?
A crucial one, yeah. So sociologically speaking, race isn't really about biology. It's more about attributing superiority or inferiority based on physical characteristics that are, seen as inherited.
Okay, attributing superiority or inferiority, that's key.
Right. And what's fascinating and often kind of blows people's minds is that the whole concept of race, as we understand it today, was largely well invented. It spread during Western colonialism.
Invented, like as a tool.
Essentially, yeah. A tool to justify power structures, hierarchies, control. It served a purpose.
So it's a social construct then, not biological fact. What does socially constructed actually mean in this context?
It means it's not inherent, like having arms or legs. Think about money. A dollar bill is just paper, right?
Right.
But we, as a society, agree it has value. And that agreement makes it powerful. Race and ethnicity are similar. Societies create these categories, often based on physical or cultural cues, and then we collectively give those categories meaning and, frankly, immense power.
Okay, that makes sense. We give it meaning. So how does this social construction stuff actually show up in our lives, like day to day?
Oh, all over the place. Take a job application. Why do they ask certain background questions? How might someone's name or how they're perceived ethnically lead to unconscious assumptions about their skills or even just their fit?
Yeah, those subtle biases.
Yeah.
Or just walking into a store, maybe. Or onto campus. Ever feel like assumptions are being made about you or notice them being made about others just based on appearance?
Exactly. That's the social construction at work. It's not random. It's tied to these shared, often unspoken ideas.
And school policies, too, like how funding gets decided or what's in the curriculum. Sometimes those decisions end up affecting certain communities, often along racial lines, more than others, even if it's not, the stated intention.
These everyday things are where the deep structures become visible. So to really dig into this, we can use three major sociological theories, like different lenses, to see things more clearly.
Okay, 3 lenses. What's the first one?
Let's start with functionalism. Functionalism asks, basically, how do the different parts of society work together? What are the functions, the intended and unintended consequences of how we categorize race and ethnicity?
So looking at society like a system and how race fits into its functioning.
Precisely. Think about media representation, or the lack of it. How does that function? It might, perhaps unintentionally, reinforce certain stereotypes or ideas about groups, which helps maintain a kind of social order, even if it's an unequal one.
Or education. You mentioned schools earlier. Historically, education systems sometimes function to, sort people, often along racial lines, even if not explicitly.
Right. And that connects to Lee and Zhu's work on the success frame among some Asian American groups. Immigrant parents pushing kids towards specific careers, medicine, law, engineering.
Yeah.
The intention is often positive mobility, protection from discrimination. But it also functions to produce certain academic outcomes, which then feeds into that whole model minority stereotype.
And that stereotype itself serves a function, maybe masking challenges other groups face, or even challenges within that group.
Exactly. It gets complicated. Even college admissions, things like legacy preferences, they might not be intended to be racially biased now, but they can function that way, perpetuating historical advantages because of past discrimination.
Okay, so functionalism looks at how things work, intended or not. But what about power and inequality? Who benefits? That sounds like conflict theory.
That's exactly where conflict theory comes in. It asks the tough questions. Who benefits from these racial hierarchies? How do power imbalances and unequal resources create and maintain structural inequality?
And history gives us some stark examples, right?
Absolutely. Think about W.E.B. Du Bois writing about the post-Civil War South, the Black Belt. He describes systems like sharecropping that kept Black laborers in essentially economic slavery. They got hardly bread and meat, he wrote, while the landowners, mostly white, profited enormously. That's a clear case of who benefits.
He also talked about the physical color line, didn't he? In housing.
Yes, vividly. He pointed out how segregation wasn't just about people choosing to live near similar folks. Even well-off Black families were forced into separate areas, often near the worst representatives of the white race, while the best of both races rarely lived close. It was a system reinforcing separation and unequal access to resources.
A system designed to maintain that hierarchy.
And school funding, too. Du Bois noted the huge disparities back then. For every $5 spent on education in the South, maybe 3 went to white schools and 2 to Black schools. That's structural inequality baked right into the system, creating advantage and disadvantage.
Wow. And how does the Lee and Zhou study connect here? You mentioned the success frame earlier.
Well, think about why those parents pushed for specific conservative professions. Lee and Zhou say it stems from a fear of potential discrimination in other fields. That fear reflects an awareness of existing racial hierarchies, right? A conflict dynamic.
And the model minority myth itself,
Yeah.
from a conflict perspective, you could see it as a tool, maybe. Something that divides minority groups.
Some theorists argue exactly that. It can obscure broader systemic problems by suggesting success is purely individual effort, pitting groups against each other, which ultimately benefits the dominant group by deflecting calls for systemic change.
Okay, so we have functionalism looking at consequences, conflict theory looking at power. What's the third lens?
The third lens zooms in on everyday life. It's symbolic interactionism. This perspective asks, how is race communicated and understood through symbols, language, daily interactions, and how do these interactions shape how we see ourselves and others?
So the small stuff that has big meaning,
Yeah.
like microaggressions.
Exactly like microaggressions. Beverly Daniel Tatum defines them perfectly, those small slights, indignities, or acts of disrespect. They might seem minor, maybe even unintentional, like asking someone, where are you really from?
Yeah, I've heard that one.
But they carry huge symbolic weight. They communicate otherness. They reinforce hierarchies in subtle ways, interaction by interaction.
And Du Bois' idea of double consciousness fits right in here, doesn't it?
Perfectly. That feeling he described, always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. It's about internalizing society's gaze, constantly being aware of how you're perceived through that racialized lens. It shapes your very sense of self.
That's powerful. And media stereotypes.
Huge influence from a symbolic interactionist view. Lee and Zhu's model minority example, popularized by things like the tiger mother stereotype. These media portrayals create powerful symbols and scripts that shape expectations, both for people inside and outside the group.
Right. And Du Bois even mentioned how spirituals, the sorrow songs, were turned into caricatures on minstrel stages, taking something deeply meaningful and twisting its symbolism.
Exactly. And think about those stark examples from Du Bois' writing again. His character, John, despite his education, being told by a judge, go round to the kitchen door, or being racially slurred after his child's funeral.
Those aren't just mean words. They're powerful symbolic acts enforcing racial status.
Precisely. They communicate place, hierarchy, and disrespect through everyday interaction, reinforcing that veil Du Bois spoke of between racial groups.
Okay, these lenses are really helpful. Let's dive deeper now into the specific readings, connecting them more directly to things people might encounter.
Sounds good. Let's start with Eduardo Bonilla-Silva and colorblind racism. His main point is pretty provocative. He argues that saying, I don't see race, this idea of colorblindness, isn't the solution to racism. It's actually a new form of it.
How so? It sounds good on the surface, but treating everyone the same.
It does sound good. But Bonilla-Silva argues that by claiming not to see race, people often end up denying the reality of existing racial inequalities. They ignore the systemic issues we've been talking about. It essentially allows the status quo, the existing inequalities, to continue unchallenged.
So it's like saying problem solve when the problem is still very much there.
Exactly. So a question for you listening is, where have you heard this I don't see race idea? Maybe in a classroom. A teacher saying they treat all students the same, but maybe missing that some students face barriers others don't.
Or in the workplace. HR policies that claim neutrality but don't actually address biases in hiring or promotions.
For sure. And you see it all over social media, right? Comments dismissing race as irrelevant when people are talking about real inequalities. Bonilla-Silva's point is that this language, even if well-intentioned, functions symbolically to erase the lived experiences shaped by race and prevents real solutions.
Okay. Now, Beverly Daniel Tatum's Defining Racism, can we talk? Her core message seems to connect strongly to conflict theory, right?
Absolutely. Tatum really emphasizes that racism isn't just about mean individuals, bad people with bad attitudes. It's a system, a structure woven into society that produces and perpetuates racial advantage and disadvantage. It's structural.
So the challenge is to spot those systems, even when there isn't obvious, hate involved.
Right. Can you see institutions or practices that systematically benefit one group over others? Think about pay gaps, not just CEO pay, but in everyday jobs, service work, skilled trades.
Yeah, like Du Bois talking about workers getting hardly bread and meat. That's a systemic outcome, not just bad luck.
Exactly. The system itself, whether it's historical debt cycles or modern wage structures, can perpetuate those gaps. Or look at representation in different fields. Nursing, welding, law enforcement. Are certain groups clustered in some areas and absent in others?
Lee Zhou's research speaks to that too, right? The push towards certain safe professions because of perceived bias elsewhere suggests a systemic construct.
It really does. It shows how even supposedly successful groups are navigating a system where opportunities aren't perceived as equal across the board. Their choices are shaped by that systemic reality, reflecting a conflict over resources and opportunities.
What about access to things like college prep or financial aid?
Huge systemic issue. Du Bois pointed out the ludicrously inadequate schools for Black students in his time, which obviously impacted college access. Today, disparities in school funding, access to AP classes, SAT prep, these things still create unequal pathways.
And Lee Zhou showed the flip side, parents using ethnic resources like special directories or investing heavily in tutoring to overcome those systemic hurdles.
Right. It highlights how navigating the system often requires extra resources or specific cultural capital, which isn't equally available to everyone. It reinforces that conflict over access.
Okay, final, let's really dig into Lee Zhou's The Success Frame in Asian American Achievement. You've mentioned it a few times. What is that success frame exactly?
So they found that among some Chinese and Vietnamese immigrant families, there's this really specific, often quite narrow definition of what success looks like. It usually means specific high-status careers, doctor, lawyer, engineer, scientist, and getting into very elite universities. That's the frame.
And it's supported by ethnic capital, you said, like community resources.
Yeah, community networks, supplementary education programs, shared expectations, things that help channel kids towards meeting that frame.
But there's a paradox, right? The achievement paradox.
This is the really fascinating and sometimes painful part. The frame often drives high achievement, yes. But for those who don't perfectly fit that narrow definition, even if they're successful by any objective standard, they can feel like failures or ethnic outliers.
Like the examples in their research.
Exactly. They talk about Carolyn, a visual effects coordinator, good job, making $60,000, graduated from a solid state university. But she felt like the black sheep because her brother went to a UC, her cousins to Ivy Leagues. She didn't fit the frame.
Wow. Even making $60.
Or Sarah, running her own successful business, earning $160,000. But she felt embarrassed because her friends had gone to grad school and she hadn't. It shows the incredible symbolic power of that specific frame.
So where might people listening have seen this model minority stereotype or this success frame pressure show up?
Oh, it could be anywhere. In school, maybe intense academic pressure, competition, a feeling that only certain fields are acceptable. You definitely see it in media portrayals, right? Very specific, often narrow depictions of Asian Americans.
Like the Tiger Mother thing, yeah.
That's a big one. Or even within families. Sometimes it's about cultural pride, but sometimes it's intense pressure that creates real tension if someone chooses a different path. Like their example of Paul, an artist who felt so alienated from the frame, he changed his name and called himself the whitest Chinese guy you'll ever meet.
That's intense, and it has real consequences.
Absolutely. Lee and Zhou mention research showing lower self-esteem among Asian American college students compared to other groups, despite higher grades. It's that internal conflict, the pressure of the frame, impacting mental well-being. That's a symbolic interactionist outcome. The meaning attached to success shapes self-perception.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. As we wrap up, maybe some final thoughts for people to chew on.
Definitely. It's worth taking a moment to reflect. What have you personally experienced or observed about how race and ethnicity shape expectations, your own or those placed on others?
And how does that idea of Du Bois, that double consciousness, feeling watched and judged, resonate with any of that?
Yeah, and remember, these deep dives, they aren't just academic exercises. The goal is to give you tools, sociological thinking, to better navigate the world.
So how can we use this practically to understand people better, maybe advocate for fairness, without just falling back on simplistic ideas?
Well, it means recognizing the systems Tatum talks about, seeing how those everyday interactions, the symbolic stuff, reflect bigger patterns, as symbolic interactionism shows us. And it means challenging assumptions, especially that colorblind idea Bonilla-Silva critiques, because it prevents us from seeing and addressing the real inequalities that conflict theory highlights.
Seeing the structures, the symbols, and the power dynamics all at once.
Exactly. And maybe one final provocative thought, building on Lee and Zhou. They suggest that separating race from rigid definitions of achievement could actually benefit everyone. It could boost self-esteem, fight stereotype threats.
So what would it actually look like if society, really redefined success? If we genuinely celebrated all kinds of different paths and talents without these heavy racialized expectations?
It's a big question. How might that kind of shift unlock potential, foster real understanding across all communities? Something to think about.